Anyway, there's that king eider. And I won't revisit that. But the map of Alaska here is showing Anchorage, where most of your flights are going to begin and end. The green line indicates areas I've covered throughout the state by road. And then a lot of flights up to Barrow are going to go through Fairbanks or Prudhoe Bay and over to Barrow. The program this evening is going to go from Barrow over to Kaktovik. And then we're going to go out to Nome. Flights to Nome often go through Kotzebue, so you can make it above the Arctic Circle by visiting Nome and taking one of those flights that go through Kotzebue. And then the last segment of the journey will be out to Dutch Harbor at Unalaska Island, and some time spent on St. George Island and St. Paul Island in the Pribilofs out there in the middle of the Bering Sea. This is your flight coming into Barrow, Alaska over the Arctic Ocean. Still have sea ice on the shore there in June. And this is a lot of air travel, and it is tedious, especially with all the camera gear, but most of the flights have beautiful scenery out the windows if it's clear, with mountains and glaciers. You can see the glacier running out of this mountain here. You actually can see Denali, which is often shrouded by clouds from the ground, but you can always see it poking up through the clouds from the air. Right across from the airport is a little mileage post here, and interestingly enough, you're as close to Paris, France, as to some areas in Florida, and you're still 1,500 miles from the North Pole here. Or I'm sorry, 1,300 miles from the North Pole at Barrow. The native language, welcome, is the G's fairly silent, so Polygons, sorry. And Barrow recently had a name change back to the native name for the community there is Ukpiagvik. Okay. Not sure how we got out of there. So on a recent trip to Barrow, everybody was tired, and we hit the hotel room, which is about a block from the airport. And folks were settling down, unpacking, and getting ready to doze off. And I had a knock on my door. Dick, who is actually on the program this evening watching, says, "Hey, what is this? What is this shorebird out the window?" And you can see that the thing is almost, we're looking fairly steeply down at a ruff, a female ruff, in the flooded backyard of the hotel. So a great way to start a trip. Having a little bit of a lag here. Not sure if it's showing on your end. This is one of the few tourist stops in Barrow. It is the whalebone arch. The bones are actually from the jaw bones of a bowhead whale, and you'll see the skeleton of the boat to the left here. And that skeleton actually is a sealskin boat when fashioned with the skins that are sewn together here. And they actually go out and hunt bowhead whale in the traditional manner with these sealskin boats. The tundra at Barrow is pretty flat, kind of featureless, and not all that attractive. The skull here is of a caribou that visit in the fall or later in the summer. We never see caribou, live caribou at Barrow in June. And just a couple more images here to show the featureless tundra that is Barrow. Here's a Arctic fox working the tundra. This is as close as I've ever been to one. They're really skittish. likely trapped for fur there. The town itself of Barrow is not much to see. It's covered in snow most of the year, so they don't have to look at this stuff. And I'm sure it's expensive to haul things to the dump, but more importantly, it's expensive to get parts. So if a snowmobile or an ATV or a car breaks down, they just leave it sit in the side yard so they can scavenge it for parts later. This is a woolly lousewort, one of the few flowers at Barrow. It's mainly yellow grasses and some mosses and lichens that you see on the ground. A little bit of willow scrub as well. The weather at Barrow can be quite cold, with lows around 30 in June, and highs normally don't get quite up to 40 degrees. There's often a strong east wind, and overnight and early in the morning, oftentimes a fog will come in off the Arctic Ocean, and that's pretty much when it's time to shut down the photography. But some nights it does stay clear and beautiful for all-night outings. That's Georges McNeil. Hey, Georges, I know you're on the video today. But when the light stays clear, you get beautiful light, and you photograph the iconic king eiders. This is the male and female. A close-up of a male here, showing a little bit of a serration on the bill. Just gorgeous colors. Love getting close to these birds. They're pretty accommodating most of the time. It's the female king eider. I call her the Queen of Kings. Quite attractive in her own right. And a trip to Barrow is not a trip to Barrow without some wonderful king eider images. The other eiders at Barrow, spectacled eider. This is the female. Note the blue eye on her. And gorgeous male flapping. These images were taken after midnight. There's a sign asking folks to protect the Steller's eiders and report any sightings of them, any injured or dead birds, etc. And for the most part, I think they don't really hunt the Steller's eiders there. So male Stellers, along with the female, dark chocolate, and another shot of the male showing what I believe are eye spots. I can't find anything in the literature here, but when the bird is feeding facing the water, excuse me, this points up, this dark area, and even when the bird tips, this dark shoulder spot stays above the water. I think it's like an eye spot, a defense mechanism like we see on butterflies and moths. Got a beautiful Pacific loon here. And the red-throated does breed also up at Barrow, but not as commonly as the Pacific. The technique for getting these photographs is to get out in the water into some of the shallow ponds. Here Brian Small is not doing it the right way. You're supposed to tuck your vest into your waders so you don't ruin very expensive teleconverters and things like that in your pockets. Greater white-fronted goose is a very common waterfowl species up there. It's the most common goose. There's also snow goose and brant. Pintail is one of the common ducks that breeds at Barrow, along with the long-tailed duck. And we see longtails on Lake Erie here in Northwest Ohio, more so over in Eastern Ohio. In the winter, and they're in a beautiful black and white plumage. They have a little bit more color on them in the spring. And note the long pointed wings of the male. He's built for speed. The female's got shorter wings, a little bit more broad, and she's much more maneuverable. So you see these display flights where the male is chasing the female, and as he's closing in on her, she'll do a very sharp turn or a very steep climb to shake him off her tail. Here we have a pair of rock ptarmigans. The males will hold on to that brilliant white plumage well into the summer, well after it's advisable to do so. And the belief is that they keep those feathers so that they can attract predators away from the nest and away from the female and young. That's commitment right there, with gyrfalcons around and peregrines and various other predators like the Arctic fox. Beautiful male rock ptarmigan here, just starting to get a hint of his non-winter plumage. Arctic tern is a bird that's expected at Barrow. And this is a lemming, a brown lemming. There's also collared lemming on the tundra. And this is the base of the food chain, basically, for all the birds and mammals. The snowy owls breed and raise a lot of chicks when the lemming population is high. They don't do near as well during a low population part of the when the cycle is low for lemming population. It's also short-eared owl in northern harrier. Here we have a parasitic jager, another predator that's going to do well when the lemming population is high. And the massive Pomeranian jager, just a real beast of a bird. When the lemming population is low, these predators are going to be going after the songbirds, the eggs, the young, even the adults. I watched a Pomeranian jager tearing apart a Lapland longspur, an adult bird that it had caught. So when the population of lemmings is high, it's good for the predators, and it's good for what would be the other prey species. Got a glaucous gull here, and Sabin's gull. We encounter this one pretty much every trip to Barrow. This is a Lapland longspur, one of the most common nesting songbirds at Barrow, especially away from town. You can see how well its plumage is designed to blend in with the dried willow leaves from the previous fall. They're on the ground here, and when I say willow leaves, I'm talking about willow bushes that only get maybe 5-6 inches tall. There's some other habitat types that you might find include mosses and lichens, and then you see the little willow buds here with this savanna sparrow. Savanna is also out on the tundra, but not near as common as Lapland longspur. And the common breeding bird closer to town and really around any outbuilding, any man-made structure, the snow buntings are pretty common as well. The semi-palmated sandpiper is arriving to breed in early June up on the high Arctic tundra, and they're really pushing things to extreme. You know, we think of them as a mud and warm weather kind of bird, is when we see them around Northwest Ohio and in migration. And they're pretty quiet. They don't do a whole lot. Not very exciting bird to watch, but they are spectacular on the breeding grounds. This is a semi doing a display, running across the mud flat, wings up, yelling, chasing other males, trying to impress the ladies. Here's one doing his calling. And they also do a hover flight, which is really awesome. They can hover for well over a minute in place, remaining almost stationary, which allowed me to slow the shutter speed way down to intentionally blur the wings, but still maintain sharp focus on the face because it is holding so steady. This ruddy turnstone is showing how well camouflaged he is for the tundra. Got a little bit of black soil there, and there's a lot of dark in the plumage of this bird. He also has the oranges to match up to the willow leaves and other bits of the tundra, as is this dunlin. I've watched many sandpipers hunker down when there's a aerial predator overhead. And when they flatten themselves on the ground, they disappear. Here's a Dunlin. He's displaying, he's doing his little march. There was a female down in a little low spot nearby. He marched his way down there, did his call, carried on a little bit, and copulated for 45 seconds, which is about a record in the bird world. White Rum Sandpipers will also do wing up displays. I've observed them with the wing up, calling, carrying on. And what I believe happened with this particular situation is there was a second White Rum Sandpiper nearby that the group had not noticed. And I believe we got between the two birds, and they were just kind of trying to stay in contact with each other. Kind of like, hey, I'm still here, don't leave me. And there's a view showing the backside there, clearly showing off that white rum. American golden plovers are common on the tundra at Barrow. And this particular bird was working out his differences with another male at what appeared to be a territory boundary. Shorebirds will do parallel display flights and marches on the ground at their territory boundaries, just trying to kind of work out the property boundaries situation. Here we have a red phalarope. This is actually the female. In phalaropes, the female is much more brightly plumed than the male. She's kind of got it made. She lays the eggs and leaves the male to tend to the nest, so he needs to be more camouflaged for that purpose. She will lay sometimes multiple clutches with different males, laying enough eggs to equal her body weight. It's a pretty amazing feat. And here's that male. He's no slouch either. He looks pretty good. And the phalaropes will often tip feed almost like a dabbling duck. And we'll take a look at the red-necked phalaropes that are also there at Barrow. This is, again, the female first, more brightly plumaged, just really sharp dressed. And the phalaropes are also known for their spin feeding. Here's a male red-necked phalarope spinning in place. The inside eye, I guess if the bird's spinning clockwise like it is here, the right eye always tilted down a little bit, looking for little invertebrates to be pulled up from the bottom of the pond. The buff-breasted sandpiper is really one of my favorite birds, and one of the reasons that I went to Alaska the very first time to the high Arctic. I went up to Barrow for the eiders and over to Arctic National Wildlife Refuge looking for yellow-billed loons and buff-breasted sandpipers. But the buff-breasteds are well known for a lekking type of behavior, much like the grouse and prairie chickens form a lek to display to the females. The males fight and carry on. Here the male is in an embrace display with what looks like two females. Occasionally a male buff-breasted sandpiper will imitate a female to try to come in and break up any kind of courtship activity. It's a neat little tidbit. And this most recent trip to Alaska, I saw what I dubbed the trampoline display, something I've never read about anywhere else in the literature, but I observed a buff-breasted sandpiper jumping into the air, flapping a few times, gaining, maybe 5 feet off the ground, dropping back down, and then bounding right back up as if he's being sprung back up by a trampoline. And this happened repeatedly, and I was too dumbfounded to actually photograph it. This is a group of long-billed dowitchers, and the day prior to this, I had no dowitchers on the tundra anywhere, and a flock showed up the next day, and they got into this little dispute where one would pick up a little twig and try to take it, and another one would try to take it, and the birds would start fighting, and two birds would fly off, beating each other up, biting at their bellies, wing smacking each other, and the group got smaller as this continued, but then other birds would come back into the fray. And this went on for a great period of time where, you know, the stick had some kind of meaning to these birds, a little willow twig, probably no more than 1.5 inches long. They would pick it up, set it down, and stand back and wait for the next guy to try to get it. And it certainly had something to do with pair bonding, because the next day the tundra was littered with pairs of long-billed dowitchers. I thought it'd be neat to read about that when I got home, but there's just nothing in the literature describing that behavior at all. All these cool shorebird behaviors, Pectoral Sandpiper has to be one of my favorites. Here he is with his chest all puffed up, looking big and bad. And they do this flight. I'm going to start this over here. This is the song that they make during their display flight over the females. And interestingly, I observed a pattern. They would do this flight, land, circle back around, get back up on the tundra mound, and repeat it. So I decided I could get in position to try to capture some images of the flight display. Here's the male doing the calling with his chest all puffed up. Sadly, at the end of the flight, you know, he looks like he's had a few too many beers. He's got the spare tire going, well past middle age looking here. And here's the peck on the ground doing a wing up display, calling, dancing around. And he's got his chest distended here. He looks like he's the pregnant one, but you'll notice off on the side, there's a female that he's trying to attract the attention of. Some of the other shorebirds that we see at Barrow can be some specialties from Asia. This is a redneck stint. And I've also observed ruff on about half of my visits to Barrow. Nice male displaying. This bird was actually displaying to a female pectoral sandpiper, much to the dismay of the male pectoral sandpiper. There's the close-up of the male with some weird nodules on the face, little fleshy nodules. No trip to Barrow would be complete without driving the pea gravel beach out to Point Barrow. We always try to see who's the furthest most, or the northernmost bird in the U.S. by seeing which bird is the furthest out there on the point. Oftentimes it'll be a pintail or a pectoral sandpiper. Here's the Humvee that we take out there, or we used to take out there. Those vehicles aren't at Barrow anymore. This is the crew out there on the point on that very first trip. Some more recent crew out there at the point in the FJ Cruiser. It's a great off-road vehicle. And you got to keep your eyes out for polar bears out here when you get out towards the point. From Barrow, we're going to jump over to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. What I found at the refuge is you don't have the luxury of a vehicle to take you to different areas and find a lot of birds. So it's a lot of walking and you know, much lower productivity because of the limited amount of territory that you can cover. So the flight to Kaktovik up here goes through Prudhoe. You're about 100 miles east of Prudhoe Bay here. And you might not be able to see it over here, but there's a image of the state of South Carolina. And that's about how large the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is, nearly the same area as South Carolina. I marked on the map here, Camp 1 on the Canning River. We spent several days, and then the plane picked us up and took us down to Camp 2 for the remainder of our visit to Arctic National Wildlife. Your trip into the refuge, if you're going to be on the coastal plain, is going to start at the village of Kaktovik. And upon arrival, just walking around town and the tundra near town, it's going to pick up species like king eider. We see king eiders at Barrow, but mostly just migrating past offshore. I said king eiders, these are common eiders, my apologies. And kids play in the street at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning because it's still daylight. Here I have my short lens on my camera body and 2 kids smearing up my lens elements. The young man on the right decided that his breath had fogged my lens, so he grabbed his sleeve and shoved it over his hand and went in and wiped my lens element and scratched it all up with his dirty sweatshirt. That cost me a few $100. There's the troublemaker on the right, giving the bunny ears to probably his sister there. And the chubby little boy in the back is so cute. He was so nice. This is the view from the plane on the way to Camp 1. The Canning River below. The tundra looks really featureless and has been reported to be barren of life by some politicians that would like to drill the refuge. But we're going to see in a minute that it is far from barren. The polygons of the tundra have as many names as the Eskimos have as many names for the polygons as they have for snow because there's so many different kinds. Here we see some depressions filled with water with elevated tundra around. And this is a different type of polygon with elevated tundra, and then it's lined and outlined by lower depressions filled with water. Great breeding habitat for shorebirds. Here's our guide to David. We had so much stuff, the plane had to make 2 trips. David's down there setting up the cook tent here. And we have our gear up away from the tent to avoid bringing bears towards the sleeping area. Here's David doing some cooking with my friend Sharon. Sharon, your luggage is better built for the airport than the tundra runway. Here's a view from my tent looking out over the featureless tundra. But we had these little Arctic ground squirrels right around camp. They're super cute. We also had the caribou coming right through camp. Here's a caribou crossing the river. We are just on the east side of the Canning River, just inside the refuge. So this caribou is not confined by boundaries. It's coming from outside the refuge, coming into the protected area. And this first camp was a little higher up slope in the foothills of the Brooks Range, a little bit drier tundra. Golden plovers were pretty common there. Actually found this nest of American golden plover eggs. And this first camp, there was a lake nearby known to have nesting yellow-billed loons. So upon arriving, we set up camp and hiked over to the lake. And unfortunately, it was mostly ice covered with a long-tailed duck on it and not much else. I actually left and came back the next day, and all of the ice was gone from the pond. It was amazing. It just cleared and disappeared overnight. Was fortunate to get a relatively distant shot of this yellow-billed loon. And I did actually find the nest of this bird that had 1 egg had been laid already. So gone from ice-covered, snow-covered peninsula to totally melted, and an egg was laid all within 24 hours. This caught me by surprise. I was walking along. I thought I stumbled upon a pile of cigarette butts. Upon closer inspection, this is willow ptarmigan, or I should just say ptarmigan droppings. And this is a rock ptarmigan, again, holding on to that bright white feathering to attract any predators away from its mate. This guy has given up on that task and decided he's going to be better off to get dirty and hide out in the rocks. So I've actually witnessed ptarmigan that are digging around in the soil and the dirt, trying to darken up those bright white feathers. And he's going to blend in a lot better being around these bright rocks. The willow ptarmigan call is one of the best calls in the bird world. Maybe one of the other best is a ruffed grouse if you hear a hen squealing. But the willow ptarmigan is one of my favorite. And to lay on the ground on my belly and photograph this bird while he was calling at point blank range was just a lifetime most incredible experience. Super cool. So we're going to move on to Camp 2 here. Here's our transportation. Note the big tires for soft landing on the rough tundra. So we were flying to Camp 2, and we were supposed to be near a shorebird research team, and they had flown in a couple of days before and rutted up the runway really bad. And our pilot was not comfortable with landing there. He was sure he could get us on the ground, but he wasn't sure he'd be able to get us back out of there in a few days. So we went off searching for another place to land. And he circled the Canyon River, tipped the plane up on its wing, and we felt some G-forces there. So he finally dropped us off on Mars. This isn't actually Mars, obviously, but along the Canyon River, it was a really bleak and desolate place to be dropped off. It was quiet, not a bird to be found, and dusty and just really it was kind of a letdown because we had hoped to find buff-breasted sandpipers with the shorebird team. But then the weather cleared a little bit and light hit the Brooks Range. Here you've got the widening Canyon River as it reaches the delta near the ocean. We're wildly excited to see grizzly bear tracks going right by our camp. Pretty good sized one too. It's a 10.5 on the left. And so once the weather cleared and it got daytime, there was quite a bit of bird activity actually. We came across this still sandpiper. They are very uncommon over at Barrow, but much more regular to the east. And we lucked into finding our own buff-breasted sandpipers. And we had one night where the birds displayed late into the evening. Note the coloration too, how well they blend into the habitat. Here's a male buffy doing his best to impress the ladies. The female here apparently doesn't care too much. And as I was photographing this buff-breasted, I noticed that I had to keep backing up. It was displaying and coming closer and closer to me. And a contact and friend of mine had told me that they will display to people as well as to other birds. So I just kept having to pick up my tripod and back up 5 feet to photograph this bird. The next night we were hoping for a repeat performance, but all was quiet. There was this tough guy, Parasitic Jager, was hanging out near the lek, and I think that probably kept the birds from displaying the next night. So back at Kaktovik and getting ready to catch our flight, someone came into the, we'll call it a hotel, but came in and said there was a polar bear down by the airport runway at the bowhead whale carcass. So we negotiated a rate to get hauled down there and photographed this polar bear right before catching the plane out down the Fairbanks. We're going to go from Prudhoe now out to Nome. All the flights to Nome originate in Anchorage, and many of them go through Kotzebue in kind of a counterclockwise direction. There are some direct flights to Nome as well. Nome's going to be a little warmer than the Arctic tundra areas that struggle to get up to 40 degrees. I've seen 70-degree days in Nome. Nome's history is of being a gold mining town. Here's an old dredge along a river. The more current method of gold mining is, maybe you've seen the reality program called Bering Sea Gold, but they're out there basically vacuuming the bottom of the Bering Sea off the coast of Nome. One of the tourist attractions at Nome is the train to nowhere. There's no track, just a train sitting there. There's a long and involved story that we're not going to get into. The light at Barrow, Barrow and Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was up for 24 hours. At Nome in June, you're going to be looking at more like 20 to 21 hours of daylight. Very exhausting to try to work all the good light. That's a red-throated loon, common in the ponds around town. Redneck grebes are also at Nome. Not nearly as common as the loons, but put on a great display in the fog for us one morning. The tundra is different here. At Barrow and Arctic, it's wet, it's spongy, it's got long yellow grasses. I don't know if they ever green up during the spring. They must at some point in the summer green a little more. But at Nome, you've got higher elevations, you've got more rocky tundra. You get into a lot more flowers. This semi-palmated plover is in the, I'm going to draw a blank on the flower. It's in the rhododendron family. There's an American pipit with more of the rhododendrons. So there's a lot of opportunity for really stunning scenes with the birds in the flowers at Nome. Lapland longspurs were great at Barrow, but amongst these flowers along the beach, they're in the pea family. The Lapland longspur in the cotton grass, which is actually in the sedge family. Got a black-bellied plover hanging out in some of the tundra flowers, as with the American golden plover. So that a lot of the same birds at Nome and Barrow, but the scenes at Nome are quite interesting with the color added. This is Pacific golden plover. They do tend to like a little bit drier, rockier habitat. And Western Sandpiper, which we see kind of hanging out more as a migrant at Barrow, but they are the most common nesting shorebird at Nome. In fact, this is a Western Sandpiper chick. Couldn't be more than a few days old. I've actually seen chicks still in a cracked open egg, Western Sandpipers. This is a red knot. Notice its chest color and the lichens on the rock over here, how well he can blend into these rocks if he needs to hunker down. Speaking of hunkered down, this bird is sitting on a nest, and we didn't see the bird until one of the participants on the trip was within a stride or two of it before he spotted it, and the bird never budged off the nest. Nome is one of the few places on the mainland where you can see Aleutian tern. And being so far west at Nome, you have a great opportunity of seeing some of the Asian species that do trickle across and nest in western Alaska. This is an Arctic warbler. The blue throat is just a stunning, stunning bird. Also one of those Asian species. Yellow wagtail is another. And the lesser sand plover here, though probably not breeding at Nome, you do pick up quite a few vagrants. I've had wandering tattlers expected at Nome. I've also had gray-tailed tattler, an Asian species, and common cuckoo at Nome as well. Golden crowned sparrow is one of the common nesting songbirds, as is orange crowned warbler, and a litany of other warblers really, blackpoll, yellow, Wilsons. I think we'll see more of those coming up. We have a golden eagle nest, which appears to be high up on the cliff, but actually I was standing on the seat of the car shooting through the sunroof to photograph this golden eagle and chick at the nest. So a number of mammals that you might encounter along the way at Nome. You've got a couple of baby moose here, which are just adorable. This red fox might seem adorable, but for the fact that he has an egg and a couple of chicks tucked in his mouth. And the short-eared owl that was affected by that was not very happy about it. Some other predators at Nome. You've got long-tailed jager, nice photo bomb in the background. At Nome, the long-tailed jager is the most common jager, parasitic, and then the Pomeran is quite rare at Nome, whereas the long-tailed is fairly rare up at Barrow. Here's Les photographing some Arctic terns. Very territorial, even if there's no nests around. If you're in their area, they will dive bomb you. This is from a couple miles further up the road where they were actually nesting. And there's an Arctic tern coming in for a landing, and you see a single egg poking up right there. The Arctic terns can be quite common along the rivers, and they'll sit on the bridges and allow you to pull up and photograph them at point blank out the car window. A number of the birds that migrate to Nome cover just an amazing amount of ground, real feats of migration. The northern wheat ear is going to migrate out of Nome all the way to Africa. And the whimbrel, they actually have been known to fly through hurricanes. So there was a bird fitted with a tracking device that flew through Hurricane Irene. She spent 27 hours flying into the hurricane, traveling just 9 miles per hour. Until she hit the backside of the eye, her speed increased to almost 100 miles per hour. And she covered the rest of her trip in just a couple of hours at that point. But just amazing, these birds, what they can survive. And here's kind of the route showing whimbrel migration. In the southbound migration, they may be farther east in the Atlantic to where they're closer to Africa than they are to the mainland North America. And then the bar-tailed godwit is maybe even more impressive than the whimbrel, in that this bird is going to cover in a nonstop flight that can take 8 days and cover almost 7,000 miles all the way to New Zealand. So they fly off out of Alaska head out over the Pacific Ocean and kind of make a bend at Hawaii, come all the way down to New Zealand. It's hard to fathom. So moving on from Nome, you have to fly back to Anchorage and then out to Dutch Harbor. The flight situation in Alaska is kind of mind-boggling right now. There is no direct flight from Anchorage to Dutch Harbor. There's a wildly expensive flight that gets you to Cold Bay, which is right about here. And then you have to switch planes to another airline to get the rest of the way to Dutch Harbor. The problem is Cold Bay only has about 50 people in town and no place to accommodate anyone if there's a mechanical difficulty or a weather delay or anything like that. So it's really a logistical nightmare right now. I'm hoping Alaska Air and Grant Aviation get their act together and get that one figured out. We may have to take Dutch Harbor off the route if they don't get that squared away. My trip to Dutch Harbor, the most recent trip, was just, it was like a planes, trains, and automobiles movie. If it could go wrong, it went wrong as far as transportation. We got delayed by mechanical difficulties at Anchorage, had to find accommodations overnight at a time when Anchorage is mostly booked. We got that resolved, got booked for the next flight. They double booked a seat and one of the participants got pulled off the plane. And I thought, a few minutes later, I thought to ask the kid next to me, I'll give you $100. I told him I'd give him $100 if he got off the plane. And he was ready to do it, but they closed the door. So we lost a participant at Anchorage who caught up with us a few hours later on the next flight. So it was a lot of fun. We had a fire alarm at the Grand Aleutian in Dutch Harbor, and then we were delayed by volcanic ash on our way to St. George for 2 days. So loads of excitement. You got to stay flexible, got to stay a half step ahead. This is the airline that used to service a lot of the Aleutians and Pribilof Islands. Penn Air was affectionately known as Win Air, as if in when are we going to fly? Lots of delays, but Penn finally went out of business. This is in the airport here, the #1 fishing port in the country at Unalaska. Some of you may be familiar with the Deadliest Catch reality program that's based out of Dutch Harbor. This is what the fishing boats look like in that program. Crabbing is also wildly popular, and if you are on one of the islands during the right time, it would be beneficial to look through the crab pots for a stray Asian songbird looking for protection. This is something you don't see every day. Nesting eagles, danger. At the post office at Dutch Harbor, the eagles are pretty accommodating, quite used to people. They get a lot of food from the fishing boats, feeding out of the nets. When they roll the nets out to dry, there's bits of fish on the nets, and the eagles come in to scavenge that. And this bird is actually, there's a nest right below this sea stack. And George Sidlowski, hey George, I know you're on the program. And I climbed down an adjacent cliff to photograph this bald eagle. This is the Grand Aleutian, a big, wildly expensive hotel at Dutch Harbor. Here's George and I trying to kill some time, waiting for good enough weather to go out on the boat to do a pelagic. Nice big snow drifts from the winter before, hadn't melted off yet. Cold, rainy, gloom and doom. So we found some things around town to photograph. Beautiful church. Note the bald eagle sitting on top of the cross. The Nirvana is no more. It's been sitting there for a few years now. Here's George. We're going to finally photograph some birds and get wet in the process. It's a gray-crowned rosy finch. I believe the birds out on the Aleutians are maybe a subspecies of gray-crowned. Got a sea otter here. He's not bashful, he's actually eating, shoving clams in his face. Another sea otter. Red fox was hunting the hillside. So there's plenty to photograph while we wait for the weather to clear and have an opportunity to go out on the boat. Here's a rock ptarmigan. Beautiful summer plumage on this male. We even resorted to photographing some waterfalls at one point, and in the process came across this American dipper. Again, George and I waded a very fast running, fairly deep stream to get in position for this photograph. We've got the Columbine out at Dutch. And this is a spotted lady slipper, and I believe it hybridizes naturally with another lady slipper out there. So I'm not sure if this is a pure spotted lady slipper or one of the hybrids. So finally, we get the call to get to the docks, and the first seabird we photograph is this pigeon guillemot that's actually nesting in the hull of an old ship. Oops. And before we ever get back out of the docks, there's an opportunity to photograph this pair of pigeon guillemot. Kind of love the black on black look there. If you like harlequin ducks, Dutch Harbor's the place. Huge flocks of harlequins. Actually witnessed a bald eagle and a peregrine falcon type stoop gaining rapidly on a harlequin. That folded its wings and dove into the water, probably going 60 miles per hour to avoid the eagle. The surf birds will be feeding around on the rocks, and the boats can sometimes back up pretty close depending on where they are. And I looked away from the surf birds for a moment, and when I looked back, they had all disappeared. I thought they had flown. But they're so well camouflaged, especially in the soft light, they just totally disappeared. The black oyster catcher, fairly common on the rocky shores. But we're headed out to the baby islands for the seabirds, going for auklets, and whiskered auklet is one of the most difficult species to find in North America. The Circassin's auklet, one of the smallest auklets. Ancient merlet is pretty common out there in the rifts around the baby islands. And finally, our quarry, the whiskered auklets, pretty much can only find them at Dutch Harbor and a little further out on the Aleutians at Adak in North America. They are also, you can find them in some Russian waters as well. And then we did some chumming for seabirds and brought in a Lazen's albatross, along with a ton of northern fulmars, both light and dark morphs, and a black-footed albatross. This guy looks like he's having a great time surfing his way in to the food. They have these massive wingspans, and black-footed albatross is actually the smallest, if not the smallest, one of the smallest albatross. But they still have this massive wingspan. And there's been some tracking devices placed on albatross, and I don't have the exact numbers, but I want to share with you that the huge number of miles they cover flying around the Pacific Ocean in a single year. If you extrapolate that out by the life, the long-lived Lazen albatross, there's a female that's almost 70 years old still laying eggs. So, 70 years of traveling the Pacific Ocean, I calculated that it was equal to about 8 round trips to the moon. That's round trips there and back, 8 times under its own power. Or more accurately, under wind power. They do very little flapping, just magnificent soars. And here's a close-up of the Laysan's albatross. So we thought we were going to get out of Dutch Harbor and go to St. George Island, but we were delayed, like I said, by the ash plume, and it took us a couple of days to get out of Dutch. But we did finally make it to St. George Island, and then eventually on to St. Paul as well. Grant Aviation covers those flights. It's a short flight, really, to St. George. Only costs $125 one way. And you arrive at St. George, where the sea cliffs, the cliffs are high, lots of nesting birds, beautiful tundra flowers. And the dark phase of the red fox. Got winter wrens nesting in the cliffs. Thick-billed murres. And the sound of these cliffs are just amazing. I wish I had a recording to share with you. Just loud, lots of noise constantly. We got the parakeet auklet, and by getting low, I was able to incorporate some foreground flowers out of focus to add some color to the scene. Pretty dark and gloomy out on the islands. Expect the highs to be in the 40s. Pretty much every, highs and lows really will stay in the 40s pretty much every day. Lots of rain, lots of mist, lots of fog. This is the least auklet, the auklet that's smaller than Cassin's. Love the big wide-eyed, kind of startled look on its face. Red-faced cormorant. This is a bearded seal. And St. George Island is probably the best place in North America to see red-legged kittiwake. There's also some black-leggeds on the ground here mixed in. Gorgeous bird. The rock sandpipers, they're over at Dutch Harbor as well, but plentiful on St. George, and this one was actually photographed on St. Paul Island. And we made our transfer to St. Paul. After all the delays, our flight to St. Paul was supposed to be the next morning after we arrived at St. George, and we were hoping that we would get fogged in to get an extra day, and we did. So we stayed an extra day at St. George, and then took our flight over to St. Paul. St. Paul was supposed to be a quick connection to get back to Anchorage, but the flight was delayed, and I was able to secure a broken down, beat up old Suburban for 5 hours, and we made the most of it. We got crested auklet here, thick-billed murres. We had much better light at St. Paul, so the action and flight photography was much better. Got the, I almost said Atlantic puffin. Wow. Horned puffin on the cliffs. And the amazing tufted puffin hanging out by a nesting crevice here. This one allowed for a close-up only because there was a fox den on the cliffs, and the fox had dug a hole in the side of the cliff so it could go from the ground and get out onto the cliffs, probably to steal eggs. But I'm in this hole dug out by a fox, shooting through the hole that it made out to the cliff. Here's some happy campers, and me after 3 weeks with my Grizzly Adams going on there. Always a great time in Alaska, and always lots of smiles for the group trip at the conclusion.